I love
We have
this.
to go back to we have to go back to 1630s when the plague was in Europe. If Niccolo Amati had died, all the knowledge of violin making would have gone with him. We would never have had Guarneri del Gesù, the most famous, besides Stradivari. We would never have had Stradivari. We wouldn't have Guarneri del Gesù. We wouldn't have Carlo Bergonzi. We wouldn't have any of the great violins that we have now, because that knowledge would have passed away with Niccolo Amati.
Hello, Andrew.
Oh, good afternoon, I should say.
Yeah, well, good morning to you there. Where exactly are you based?
I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, in the United States. That's a little south of Boston, about an hour south of Boston.
Oh, okay.
A few hours from New York City. We're sort of in between Boston and New York City. It's an old American city, industrial, famous for industrial production in the 19th century. A lot of inventions, a lot of industrial inventions, weaving and machines, and it's the head of a long bay, so there was a lot of shipping, a lot of rivers, big rivers that feed down into the bay, so there's a lot of mill work and things like that. So an old American city. Yeah.
So if you go to New York, for example, how long a drive is that then?
It's about 2.5 hours.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. It's always interesting for me if people from America say it's, well, it's not that far. It's just a 2-hour drive.
Which will get you to another country in Europe.
Yeah.
Maybe two other countries.
Yeah, and in South Africa we talk the same. We say it's just around the corner, and then it's 2-hour drive. Yeah. So.
It's nothing. 2 hours is normal. In Rhode Island is the smallest state in the Union, and we're famous, or at least the natives of Rhode Island. I'm not a native to Rhode Island. I grew up over the border in Massachusetts, but they're famous for never leaving the state. They sort of make a virtue of that they've never left the smallest state in the, the country. So.
Well, this is so interesting, yeah. But you are now, and you are. I'm so glad to see that you are there where you make the violins.
I am. I at the moment I have a studio in my home. I have it's a house built in the late 1900s, 1890s, and so it has 3 floors, and up on the top floor some very nice. Smaller rooms, but they have a nice view. I have very nice light. I've been had my studio in here for about 10 years now. Before that, I was a restorer, head of a large workshop of makers and restorers in Boston, in the shop of Bruning and Son violins. But for 10 years now, I've just been doing
new instrument
making.
And how did you start making violins? What was the interest there?
So I started as a violinist, a grade school violinist, and the teacher that I had also went to the flea markets on the weekends. So flea markets are like I'm sure they have in Europe. Outdoor sales where people sell antiques or odds and ends from their homes and things like that. So he used to go to these flea markets and look for old violins and bows. So from him, I got a sort of taste that there's a life to the violin besides playing it. The violins are bought and sold, and they have some different life than just the thing that I played music on. So I had an interest in how they were put together, or how they made sound. So I went to get when I graduated from high school, I went and got a degree in music. And when I was done with that, then I decided it was time to go and study violin making, which I did in Salt Lake City. to sort of feed these two interests, the musical and the sort of craft or artistic. Violin making is a craft that encompasses a lot of skills. So there's the woodworking, obviously, and the varnishing, which is sort of allied to painting or things sort of artistic nature. It's more sculpture than cabinet work. It's more carving. There's acoustics, understanding how the instrument is put together mechanically. There's architecture, designing the design element. So a lot, and the obvious musical element, just as an instrument to make music on. So there's a lot of things you can be interested in and apply to the violin.
Yeah, and then of course you have to have a good ear for the sound.
You do, though that I would say that can be trained. It's more asking the questions about what you're listening to and trying to understand actively what sound is or how instruments work, rather than necessarily understanding pitch or things like that. You have to understand the nature of acoustics or nature of what how to explain it. So understanding what the musician needs to make music, that's, I think, more important than some abstract sense of what is a good sound or bad sound. It's understanding how sound functions, how do musicians project the sound that they are trying to make, and how do they physically make the sound. So those are two key important those are the key elements, and those can be taught. How to look at them, how to listen, how to actively identify different aspects. Just as in, I suppose, in art, you are taught how to look at a picture, not just to enjoy it, but you have to not say, "Oh, I like that," or "I don't like that." Well, it's deeper than that. You have to understand the composition, understand the palette, the visual palette, and you can teach people.
But so you started, did you start off the interest of renovating or restoring old instruments?
I would say in the beginning, I was more interested in new instrument making. So I went to a school where they taught how to make instruments, but they also taught you the skills of woodworking as it relates to violin, as it relates to violins. When I left, while I was at the school, I worked for the man who ran the school in his repair shop as a means to make a living, but also to gain experience and to see instruments, to see old instruments, and try to understand why people consider them valuable, so valuable.
Oh yeah.
What the attraction was.
Yeah.
So it's a nowadays when I began school, being a full-time maker, meaning just making new instruments, was more difficult than it is now. I think people were less accepting of new instruments than they are now. So you kind of had to go into a repair shop to make a living. But nowadays you can come right out of school and just start making instruments, and I think people are willing to buy new instruments. There's a market for the bigger market.
But what do you think over the years? I mean, there must have been many people who made violins. What do you think was it that made Stradivarius the one that made the violin that is really so famous and
Sure. So Stradivari was part of a tradition. So he didn't sort of land in Cremona from outer space. He was part of a continuing tradition of making that went back at least 200 years for violins. So a man named Andrea Amati, is accredited with inventing the violin. Though there were people working in parallel to him. There was a fellow named Gaspard da Salo, who also developed what we know as a violin at about the same time. Cremona, I don't know whether you know where Cremona is. Cremona is in northern Italy, in the Po Valley, Po River Valley. So it was an area of a lot of culture. It's not far from Milan. It's an area of sort of crossroads of trade. So there are a lot of things going on there, a lot of patronage, a lot of wealth to support. Sorry, I'm going to meander in my history here. Sorry.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, interesting.
So this fellow Andrea Amati invented the violin around, we'll say around 1540-ish. He made instruments, and he basically made it as we know it today. The violin has really not changed at all since then. We've sort of made minor adjustments to things, but essentially the design that he came up with and the way it works is the way it is. There were changes in the arching and very. If I hold an Andrea Amati up and a modern violin up, you say they were the same thing. The differences are very minor. So Andrea Amati invented the violin as a product of sort of neoclassicism, or both an interest in Greek architecture, Greek design, the idea of classical proportions and things like that, and the sort of rising science, understanding the way that people were understanding the world in scientific terms. So the instrument has a design that is based on classicism and proportion, and it functions acoustically. Like I'm pretty, I would say pretty confidently that they understood acoustics, maybe not exactly in the way that we do, but they understood how things mechanically went together. So Andrea made this violin. He worked for kings. He was a well-patronized, very wealthy. What else can I say about him? He was the patriarch of a dynasty of violin makers. So he had two sons who were violin makers. There was another next generation. His grandson is one of the most famous violin makers, Niccolò Amati, probably unparalleled for the beauty of his workmanship, even beyond Stradivari, the perfection of the workmanship and the beauty of the construction and varnish and all the details. Probably was the sort of pinnacle of the violin as a work of art, as opposed to sound, but just as a physical object. And so the Amati family all worked for the kings of Europe, the nobility, the clergy. The instruments were often commissioned and given as presents of patronage to, you wanted to, impress a king, you commission a violin and bring it to him and present him, and that would sort of get you in the door. So that's three generations of the Amatis, and that brings us up to the period of basically Stradivari. And Stradivari was born around 1644. That's the date that's attributed to it. He doesn't start making instruments until about, we'll say, 1670. He sort of, and we don't know who he apprenticed with. We don't know his history at all. We know very little about Stradivari until he starts making instruments. He says he's a pupil of Amati, of Niccolò Amati, but there's no record of that. And we have very good records of Niccolò Amati's workshop. So, and he doesn't appear in any of the records. So in those days, I think the term pupil had a sort of loose connotation. It was sort of a follower of
I
Amati.
see. Okay. Yeah.
Trying to understand the principles of
Mm.
Amati. And they were in the same town.
Mm.
So we certainly would have seen the work of Amati. It's very possible that Stradivari had some other woodworking skill as an inlayer, carver, we're not sure. And he just may have jumped from this trade into violin making. He's very ambitious, we know that. He makes he wants to assume the mantle of Amati. He wants to assume Amati's clientele, and he goes directly at that. He's a very ambitious, trying to sort of claim that. And there's only one label that says he's a student of Amati, so it's very possible he put this label in, and Amati said, "No, you can't do that. You're not my pupil." Right after that, we don't see that again, but we see plenty of instruments. To get back to the original question, he exists in a tradition of making, and it's often talked about violin making as an Italian art. The most famous violins are Italian. Really, technically speaking, we can talk about Cremonese violins. So that's a Stradivari and his sons, the Amatis, the Ruggieris, the Bergonzis, Carlo Bergonzi being the most famous, and the other most famous family, the Guarneri family. So there's this group of families. They all live in Cremona, and they all live within, minutes, literally minutes of each other. Yeah, and even Stradivari and the Guarneris lived across from each other at a certain point, across an alley from each other. So we really should speak about the greatness of Italian making as Cremonese making, and Cremonese making as just this like little parish within Cremona where these instruments were made. I think it was a very well guarded secret, the knowledge that they had, or the understanding, we'll say, that they had of how the instrument was designed and how it was made, and how it was physically made. That it was known within that group, but not outside of that group. And so Stradivari existed in that tradition. He made some modifications to the archings, and this is even, he made the changes to these details after about 1700, when he was already almost 60 years old. So it's very late in his career, or late in what we would consider most people's career, that he actually started on what we know, or what we would call the greatness of Stradivari, is basically from when he's 60 to when he's 90 years old. The production in that period is what we know as Stradivari. So he's great because he's in a tradition of knowledge that's based on design, principles of design. It's not just arbitrary, it's very carefully calculated, and acoustic knowledge, how to construct the instrument according to the laws of physics. Not something arbitrary. They knew how to put the instrument together. And he lived a long life, so not a small feat at that time. He was had the benefit of when most people in his time would, either be dead or in some kind of retirement. He's actually beginning the most significant period of time in his career and in the career of violin making. That sort of period from 1700 to 1740 is the most creative period in Cremonese violin making. We have Antonio Stradivari, we have Joseph Filius Andrea Guarneri, who's the Guarneri family. So I talked about Niccolo Amati as famous maker of just before Stradivari. He trained a lot of people because, sorry, I told you it was going to meander, and I'm not letting you ask very many questions here, but
I love
we have to go back to 1630s. 1920s, when the plague was in Europe. If
Yeah.
Niccolo Amati had died, all the knowledge of violin making would have gone with him. We would never have had Guarneri del Gesù, the most famous, besides Stradivari. We would never have had Stradivari. We wouldn't have Guarneri del Gesù. We wouldn't have Carlo Bergonzi. We wouldn't have any of the great violins that we have now, because that knowledge would have passed away with Niccolo Amati. But he made it through. He didn't marry till late in his life, so he had no heir till quite late. So he had a workshop in which he needed people to help. So he hired or brought in workmen. Normally, you keep the tradition of the knowledge that you know within your family. You pass it just down from father to son.
Oh, I see.
This time, father to son in the trade. It would not have gone to other people outside of the family. But because of the plague, Niccolo had to hire people. And because he had to hire people, he had to spread his knowledge outside the confines of his family, because all these people that he trained eventually went to other places and continued the tradition, the Cremonese tradition in other places. Yeah. But Niccolo's chief assistant, the head of his workshop, was a fellow named Andrea Guarneri. He is the patriarch of a family of violin makers that stayed in Cremona. So it's Andrea Guarneri. He had a son, Peter. He had a son, Joseph. Those two makers, one of them had a son, another Peter, and Joseph had a son, Peter, and a son named Giuseppe, who is called Del Gesù nowadays. But Giuseppe Guarneri is the most famous maker besides Stradivari. So that tradition, yeah. So where was I this knowledge manages to make it through the plague, goes through the Guarneri family, goes to Stradivari, sort of branches out in Northern Italy, because of his training. But Stradivari succeeds because he's ambitious and smart, a well-known dealer, who's a dealer in Chicago, violin dealer in Chicago, said to me one time, he said, he imagined Stradivari as the kind of guy who could go into a workshop and learn violin making in an afternoon. That he was he was probably another woodworker. He just went into Amati's shop and saw what they were doing and said, I can do that. And understood how it was done, and in a very short time.
Amazing.
So that is our long-winded answer to your question of what.
So you would say, so it was he just had that, could you say that he had the way of marketing those days his violins, that he is so famous, but that it's not necessarily that it's better than the other makers? Yes.
So certainly he was ambitious. We know that, because very early on he is trying to take over Amati's clientele. He's making instruments of a very high quality. He's trying to get into that group. He understands the trade. He is a gifted woodworker, right? Gifted maker. He understands the how to put the instrument together. He has the knowledge, the secret knowledge of Cremonese making. What else would you say that are necessary? And yeah, he has all the attributes you need, but like you say, principally an ambition to succeed. And he was very, very wealthy by the time he died. Extremely wealthy.
Really? And I had a interview the other day with Scott Woodard, a conductor there, and he did a concert, and he was talking about the red violin.
Yeah.
Was that the wood? That's the wood, the color of the wood, or what? Why is it called the red violin?
I haven't seen that movie in a long time, so I can't remember everything, but I remember the bit about putting the blood into the varnish.
Yeah.
So that is a cinematic liberty, we'll say.
Okay, yeah.
So there were makers who used blood in the varnish, actually some of the southern German makers, but we know blood oxidizes, so a red violin would turn black over time. You couldn't do that. The materials that they use, there's a famous resin called dragon's blood, because it's a very red resin. But that is a resin that's actually quite fugitive, so it will fade over time. The Cremonese makers most likely used a dye called cochineal, which is a little bug from South America that you can extract the color. It's a kind of purpley color. There are madder root, which is another root that has a red dye stuff in it. You can make red from that. So they use very traditional materials that were, they probably didn't do any of this work themselves. They actually probably went to the local chemists. So the pharmacy on the corner, so to speak, would have carried all of these things ready-made for artists to use.
Oh, I see. Yeah. And the varnish, does that make a difference to the sound of the violin?
Yes. It's more so than the varnish itself. It's the process by which the varnish is applied. So we actually know pretty confidently what the varnishes were, what they're made of, what materials we can find in the wood and on the wood. We're pretty confident. But something like baking a cake, you can analyze a cake and know what's in it, but not be sure how that cake was actually baked. So this is the sort of tricky part of old violins, or the secret isn't in the ingredients, the secret is in the preparation and the manipulation of the materials, because they're quite simple materials. So the varnishes are based on pine resin, cooked pine resin, and some drying oil, either linseed oil or walnut oil. There's some proteins to protect the wood. There were probably some stains that they used, some chemical stains based on basically on saltpeter. So they're oxidizing the wood somehow. All very simple things. But how did they get on the violin? That's the tricky part. And that's the skilled part, in a sense. That's the part that requires an experience and the intuition of an experienced craftsperson to know, oh yeah, this wood needs this, or this, it's always the same ingredients, but how do you manipulate? Just like, I'll use the comparison of a cook. A cook would get a piece of meat or some vegetables or whatever they're cooking with, and they would look at them and judge what needs to be, how they need to be prepared properly for their quality, for how they're, should I roast this potato? Should I saute it? Should I, boil it? They understand based on that particular ingredient or that particular application of material. That make sense?
Yeah, that's
yes.
Yeah.
So the sound is dependent upon the varnish. It's easy to spoil the violin by varnish that is not put on properly. You can have all the same materials that they had and not know how to put them on the violin in the correct manner and spoil it.
And now you said that these violin makers those days came from the same area in Italy. Would they have used the same wood from a specific area, so that we say, okay, those violins are made from the wood that grow in that specific region of Italy?
Um, we don't know absolutely where the wood came from. Anecdotally, we do. We know the best maple comes from across the Adriatic. So in present day in the Czech Republic or Slovenia or that sort of Carpathian mountain range area. That's where the best maple comes from. It is strong, light, often very attractively, what we call flaming. The undulation of the wood is attractive. We know that a lot of that wood came across to Venice, Venice being a great trade port. So there are records of wood coming from that area into Venice, being bought and sold, and we know that it's instrument making wood. So anecdotally, we don't know particularly for the maple because it's impossible to identify it in that terms. We know that there is no native maple in Italy like that. So the maple that's native to Italy is either a root. It's a small tree that's very gnarly and hard and very tough tree, or a very plain maple. So we can surmise that the maple came from there. The spruce, there are a number of valleys in the Tyrol that are famous for instrument wood, and we know that going back hundreds of years. So we can assume that the best spruce came from those valleys that they famously got from, that many makers got their wood from. We can also know with softwoods, with spruce, pine, things like that, we can do dendrochronology, which is the study of the rings of the tree. So doing that, we can find instruments that were made from the same tree. We can actually identify amongst, certainly in Stradivari's work, they're doing a lot of work, cataloging the fronts and which trees were used and putting them together and knowing when the trees were cut and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing that they found out is that there are other makers besides Stradivari who are using wood from the same tree. And they can be pretty definitive in saying that. So it's Stradivari probably bought logs of wood, but other people bought the same logs too, or other people had access to the wood, which is interesting.
And now the different types of wood also provides a different type of sound then.
Yes. So, for instance, I talked about the maples. The European, the Carpathian maples are often softer. They have very deep flames, which makes the wood weaker to bending. It's very attractive, but it also weakens the wood. The native maple to Italy is a very tough wood, very strong wood. So you can actually, the fiddles have to be, the violins have to be made differently. The arching has to be different. The graduations, which is the thickness of the plate, has to be different based on the woods that are used. But they will also have inherently different tone because of this difference in their density and their stiffness. Yeah. Same thing with the spruce, but you see a more consistent use of spruce than maple.
Yeah, but now for you in America, do you use indigenous wood there?
We do. So we have a few species of maple in America. We have red maple, which is sort of East Coast maple. We call it Appalachian maple or red maple. We also have red spruce, the East Coast sort of thing. There's big leaf maple, which grows in Oregon and Washington. That's a very soft wood. the red maple is quite a strong hardwood.
Mm.
We have rock maple or sugar maple, which grows in sort of northeast. That's a very, very hard wood. Spruce, we have Engelmann spruce, we have white spruce. Engelmann spruce can be a little bit softer. We have Sitka spruce, which grows in the northwest. That's a very hard spruce.
And do you use these? Do you choose then the different wood that you prefer to use? Do you have a different sound then? Do you think every violin maker has his own sound when he makes the violin?
Certainly, makers have their preferences for materials. I also use European spruce, so I imported spruce as well as the maple. There are two things going on. So a lot of the work I do is copying old instruments, so Stradivarius and Guarneri del Gesù. So you need a specific look to the maple and the spruce. They can't just be good sounding; they have to look a certain way. None of the American maples look like European maples. So it depends on what you're trying to do, what you select. Sometimes I will use American maple when I'm not concerned about how it looks.
Yeah.
It can be very beautiful, but it doesn't look like wood that Stradivari used. So I'm not trying to copy that. But yes, makers will choose materials based on their tonal preferences, what they think works the best. And I'll use all of them. You have to modify your making based on the properties of the materials. So each of them has a little different way they want to be worked, or the way they need to be shaped so that the violin is successful.
Yeah, because I saw the violin you made for the violinist Scottflavin.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's beautiful. And he said that he actually wrote you on Messenger. You communicated on social media.
Yeah. We had known each other previous to that. I had taken care of his instruments for a few years. But yeah, he was, we live about 1,000 miles away from each other. So he knew my work. It wasn't a cold call exactly.
Okay.
But, he told me what he wanted, and we had a long discussion. I actually made two violins for him. I made a Guarneri del Gesù model in 2011 for him. I actually have it here in the workshop.
Oh wow!
So this was the first violin that I made for him. And it's a Guarnerius model, and it's just in the shop for a little work. Beautiful. So in that it has a very nice one-piece back.
Yes.
Nice varnish.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
He said he wanted something more powerful than the violin he had. He was less specific, but he had very. He said, I need something that's stronger. And so I made that violin, very happy with that violin. And then a few years later, so this would be, I don't know, probably 2015 or so, that's when we had this. He says, I want another violin. I want a Stradivari model this time. So for that one, I already had an even more, a stronger idea of what kind of violin he was looking for. And that one has a very old, the materials I used on that, for instance, the back came from Czechoslovakia, but it was probably cut around 1920. It was a very, very old back. The spruce was not as old, but had some age on it. So I had very specific materials that I was using for his that I thought would work well aesthetically, but acoustically for what he wanted. And it's
so when you make these, would you say these are replicas, or would you say they are just based on principles of these old instruments?
Right. They can range from being a copy, really what we call a bench copy. So that if you had them both on the bench, they would be twins. So you can make like that. That's a very rigorous method of making. So they look, and ideally they sound the same. If you've done your homework properly and you understand the materials, you select the correct materials, both acoustically and visually. So you can make that, or you can make the other end of the spectrum just something, a fantasy of what you want to do. And there are gradations in between. Most of the work that I do is in the manner of.
Okay.
Like here's an instrument. This is a Stradivari model. So it's not a copy of a particular instrument, but it's on the same form as a Stradivari. I'm trying to make something that looks like a Stradivari. All the same techniques, all the same details. If you looked at the sound holes, if you looked at various details, I'm trying to imagine that I'm in the workshop of Stradivari and making a violin there. So it's something that Stradivari would be happy to say, oh yeah, I'm happy to put my name on that. So in the sense it's a copy of that, or we'll call it modeled on a Stradivari, or copy of a Stradivari. So yeah, there are different levels or different objectives, and it depends on the client. It depends on how I feel on a particular time. Sometimes I just want to make a violin. Sometimes I want to make something more exact, like an old violin.
And then how long does it take you from start to finish now to do the violin like that?
Right. So if you're making a copy, it can be quite a long time, because there's a lot of you're looking at the original. You're really trying to copy every single little nuance in it, and that is very challenging and very time demanding. If you just make a violin, like if I made a violin like this Stradivari copy, so to make it in what we call in the white, just the woodwork, it's a few weeks to do the woodwork, and probably a few weeks more to do the varnish work. Depends on how much antiquing, meaning how much of the varnish is going to be chipped away or made to look like that, more worn. So you can spend as much time on the varnish work as you did on the making. And sometimes it's more challenging. The varnish work, it can be more elusive. So it often can take longer, because you're trying to sort of feel your way through what the varnish wants to do and how it wants to look. So, yeah.
So it takes a while, yeah.
It takes a while.
Yeah, and then
a few days.
and a lot of patience.
Are
you a very patient man?
Yes and no. I am fairly impetuous in a certain regard. Once I get an idea in my head, I go forward on it, and it can take me quite a while before I get the idea. So my impetuosity is when I actually seized upon an idea. It can be very quick, or it can take a long time. Like, for instance, this violin. So the challenge in this violin will be, I have to conceive of what I want this violin to look like when it's done. So I need to develop a picture. I need to somehow get inside that violin, how the varnish wants to behave, how the varnish is coming off, how the texture of it, the texture of the wood. This is where it gets quite complex. Whereas the making of the violin itself in the woodworking is fairly straight ahead. I respond to the wood. The materials tell me how high the arching should be, how thick the graduation should be.
I see.
It's a more technical exercise. The
Mhm.
varnish is a more, I'm a little loath to say artistic, but it is because there's a lot of technique involved in it, but it's more, you're trying to create a painting in a certain way, a visual object. So you have to be responsive to the materials. It's a bit like a performance, actually. It's a performance that takes weeks, but it's a performance just as if you're in a quartet, you would have to be sensitive to the other players to make the performance work. A little bit like that. The varnish work is a little bit, you can't use a cookie cutter. You have to be sensitive to what the material is telling you and how it's behaving and how, so that at the end it's pleasing, that it has a integrity, has a visual integrity, and is interesting, stimulating to the player and to the people who look at it, pick it up, and both convincing that it looks like an old violin, but also it looks like a nice old violin, not just any old violin. It has to have a story that is convincing, and a story that you would want to know. I look at the varnish as a story, and you want to. It's not a static thing that you look at. Just as you look at a painting, I would say a poor painting is the one that you understand within moments. The interesting painting is the one where you're constantly drawn around the picture and look at that detail, or I wonder what's going on here, or that you are engaged, you're brought into the picture the same way the painter was brought into the scene or the thing that they're trying to paint. They were drawn in. You want to be drawn into that in the same
amazing
way. It should be an experience.
Well, these are artworks that you are making, that I think definitely. But do you have what is your signature on there? What do you have something that's?
So that varies. All my violins are branded, so that I have an actual brand.
Yeah. Let me see that.
So this is it's a steel brand that has my name on it. That was made in England, so maybe 25 years ago. It actually says Boston on it because this maker doesn't make brands anymore, and they're so beautiful. Like the font that he made is really lovely. I've never gotten a new one, even though now I'm in Providence. I still have the same brand. So anyways, when the violin is finished, I heat that up. On the inside of the back, I put a brand mark. It's burnt into the wood on the inside, so you can't. You couldn't remove it. Well, here's a scrap of wood that I use when I'm going to brand the instrument. I sort of burn it in to make sure the temperature is right and it's not too hot or too cold. So anyways, that's what this is right there. You can just sort of see.
I see. But is that now?
That goes in the center.
In the inside of the violin, or?
It's on the inside. So so in the back right here, but on the inside. So it's in a place that you can see if you're looking. It's not hard to see, but it's not right there. It's a little deeper inside the violin. And in a place that's very hard to remove. Like you would,
I see.
if you wanted to take it off, it would I wouldn't say destroy, but you change things. It would be, I would consider it permanent. And there I also brand a number inside in another place. I put a number.
Okay, so there's a number and so that you know how old the violin is that you made.
Yes, the numbers are, we'll say, fairly chronological. So, what I assign numbers when I get pieces of wood and sort out my wood and put the wood together into sort of pairs of top and back, and then I make up little sets, and then I number that set and put it in a notebook so that I have it ready. And I sort of do that at the beginning of every year. I sort of plan out what I'm going to do for a year, and I get the wood and I join it up and I make these sets. So within sort of, we'll say a dozen numbers, they're fairly chronological, but sometimes number goes before because I feel like working on a particular set of wood first. But yeah, they're essentially chronological. But I have the numbering is just so that I have a record. I keep so I have lots of notebooks.
Oh, I see. Okay,
of all the details of the construction and the materials. I have lots of notes that I keep, and at this point I have about 30,000 photographs too. I take pictures of my work as I'm working as a method of note keeping because I'm not a patient person. You asked me whether I was patient or not. I'm not always meticulous in certain things. So photographs are an excellent way to keep records because they have a time stamp on them. They are the thing that you're trying to record. You know, it is the thing. I have a little chalkboard, old schoolhouse chalkboard, and I write things on it. I put that in the picture, you know, in the frame with the object that I'm trying to record and do that. So between my notebooks and my photographic records, I have very good notes on the construction of each instrument so that I can refer to them if there's a problem. But if somebody says, "Oh, that's an exceptional instrument, what did you do there?" I can look back on the notes and say, "Well, this is what I did." And the notes are quite technical about materials, the properties, their density, their stiffness, the stiffness of the materials as I was constructing them, weights, lots of shapes of the arching. It's fairly elaborate.
So in about 300 years' time, somebody will do an interview with somebody and they will say, "Well, we found Andrew Ryan's records."
That would be a great joy to me. I hope we're still here in 300 years. I hope humanity is still here and that we're playing music and enjoying the arts.
Your violins, it's amazing what you do. It's beautiful, really. And how many violin makers are there in America? Is it a very a type of business?
We're a small bunch, you know. As a group, as a business, there are not so many of us, but there's more than you would think. So I belong to an organization called the American Federation of Violin and Bow Makers, and we probably have, I'm guessing, 250 members, 300 members, probably. We're the sort of the professional trade organization. And there's another organization called the Violin Society of America, which is a more geared to anybody. You just can join up. So it's a lot of amateur makers. And they must have at least double that in terms of people. So I would be surprised if there's 1,000 people in America, 1,000 violin makers. But, so there's probably between 500 and 1,000. That's just a guess.
Well, this is so interesting, and I want to know now. So this must be sort of a full-time job, or is it also your hobby? Or do you have something else that you do aside from violin making?
Right. Yes, it's a full-time job. I have 3 children, 2 of whom are off at college now. I have a dog. He was here earlier. I have a corgi. So I guess he's my hobby. So we take walks together. He's an 8-year-old corgi. He's usually in the workshop. There's a little bed for him. He's usually sitting around here or sitting in there's a skylight. He likes to sit under the skylight.
Really?
One spot of sunshine. What else do I like to do? I like to play music, so I'm still playing the violin.
You do?
Playing music. So, I don't practice much, but I still enjoy playing.
You enjoy
music
playing.
whenever I
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah, well, I've spoken to a watch designer, Alexander Shorokov, and he actually says that he designs these watches, but he says design is always in his head. You know, he's always thinking, and his mind is always in that space. This is why I'm asking you.
I'm
I
afraid I'm
wonder
a
if
little
you
bit
are
like
the
that.
same.
I'm a little bit like that, especially if you ask my wife.
Really?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about the instruments and letting problems run through my head. So I spoke earlier about being impetuous. When I actually get a solution, I want to like act on it. But yeah, there's always some problem, some challenges running through my head till I find a solution. So
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about those things and what am I going to do with this or that? Yeah, what design am I going to do? So that is it is a little bit of an obsession to be a.
So the expression "you're fiddling around" is quite applicable to you.
Probably a good expression around here. Yeah.
Well, this was so lovely to talk to you, Andrew. I'm really fascinated by your work, and thank you so much for your time and for showing me all these instruments as well. And
It's been my pleasure. I apologize if I talked too much and didn't let you get a word in and edgewise there.
I love it because this is so interesting, you know, and how often can you talk to a violin maker? I mean, I've never had the opportunity to speak to somebody like, you know, talking about, because also from a perspective where I'm not a musician and you don't know these things, then I hear, oh, you know, I had a violin specially made, then I think, wow, then you want to know more. And I think this is also for me very interesting to know how important these things are. And I think also now the more I speak to artists that you understand how important your role for the artists you know, is that you are the one making these instruments and that they can then play. And I think it's so important that, you know, that you also talk about this, because it's great work that you're doing.
I consider it a great privilege to be a violin maker, both to be able to practice the craft, because it's a time, a period in history in which we have tremendous resources, information, knowledge, understanding, materials, all those things that are literally at our fingertips. You know, we can go online and research things if we don't know about them. So many pictures of old instruments and all those resources that make us better violin makers, and the musical culture that there are so many fine musicians willing to support makers, willing to as Scott did, to commission instruments, both professional musicians and amateur musicians, people who are just devoted to the art, to culture, to humanities, and to the culture of our shared culture of music. So I consider it a great privilege to be able to practice this craft and engage with artists.
Amazing. Well, I wish you a wonderful weekend.
Same to you.
And I hope we can speak again sometime. If you make a interesting instrument that you want to talk about, then you let me know.
Sure. I would love to. I would love to anytime.
Yeah, I would like.
Pleasure.
It would be so. I'm so interested in what you are doing.
Thank you for inviting me into your interviews.
It's a pleasure. It's my pleasure. Andrew, have a lovely weekend.
You too.
Speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.